man stands at the window of his London townhouse, staring across the square at another man's home. Not just any home, but a palace of marble and gold, where laughter echoes through crystal chandeliers and champagne flows like water. The man at the window has everything society says he should want. A title older than memory, estates that stretch beyond the horizon, wealth that could feed a small nation. But as he stands there, night after night, watching the windows of that other house glow with warmth and life, something corrodes inside him. Something that will ultimately consume everything he is and everything he claims to love. This is not a story about poverty versus wealth. This is a story about something far more dangerous. This is about a man who had everything except the one thing that mattered to him. And in his quest to possess what he could never truly own, he would unleash a cruelty so profound, so calculated, that it would echo through generations. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most disturbing tales of the Gilded Age, a story that reveals the rot at the heart of old money society, where envy wore ermine robes, and cruelty was passed down like family silver. Welcome back to a journey through the gilded corridors of history, where fortunes were made on the backs of millions and lost on the turn of a card, where titles meant everything and humanity meant nothing. If you're new here, you've just walked into a world of gaslit ballrooms and shadowed secrets, and trust me, you'll want to stay for what's coming. But first, let me tell you about the Earl of Hatton, a man whose name should have been forgotten by history, but whose actions were so spectacularly vindictive that they became the whispered cautionary tale in every great house from London to New York. The year is 1873, and London is the beating heart of an empire upon which the sun never sets. But in the drawing rooms of Mayfair, in the gentlemen's clubs of St. James, the sun does set, and when it does, it illuminates something rotten. Our story begins not with the Earl himself, but with understanding the world that created him. A world where a man's worth was measured not by his character, but by his lineage, his acres, and his ability to maintain the fiction that his family had always been superior to everyone else's. Edward Algernon Fitzwilliam, the 7th Earl of Hatton, was born into exactly the kind of circumstances that Victorian society considered ideal. His family tree stretched back to the Norman Conquest, properly annotated and free of any embarrassing merchant blood. The Hatton estates in Derbyshire encompassed some 30,000 acres of prime English countryside, dotted with tenant farms that had belonged to the same families for generations, all paying rent to men they called my lord, as naturally as breathing. The family seat, Hatton Hall, was a masterpiece of Elizabethan architecture, all soaring towers and leaded windows, filled with portraits of disapproving ancestors and furniture that had witnessed the reigns of a dozen monarchs. Edward grew up understanding that he was special, not because of anything he had done, but because of an accident of birth that placed him in a particular womb at a particular time. His childhood was one of rigid structure and emotional desert. His mother, the Countess, was a woman who believed that affection toward children would spoil them, that love was weakness, and that an earl must be raised with the emotional accessibility of marble. His father, the 6th Earl, was a remote figure who communicated primarily through the intermediary of tutors and servants, appearing only to critique, never to praise. Edward learned early that nothing he did would ever be quite good enough, that the Hatton name carried expectations that crushed rather than elevated. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn. Because in the autumn of 1856, when Edward was 7 years old, something happened that would plant the seed of the obsession that would consume his life. The family made their annual pilgrimage to London for the season, that peculiar ritual where the aristocracy descended upon the capital to see and be seen, to arrange marriages and confirm their superiority over everyone else. And it was there, at a particularly tedious reception at Devonshire House, that young Edward encountered someone who would become the ghost that haunted every moment of his existence. His name was James Ashworth, and he was everything Edward was not. Where Edward was thin and pale, James was robust and golden. Where Edward had learned to speak in the careful, measured tones approved by his governess, James laughed freely, his voice carrying across rooms like music. But here's the crucial detail. the one that would corrode Edward's soul. James Ashworth was not an aristocrat. His father, Thomas Ashworth, had made an enormous fortune in the cotton mills of Manchester. He was, in the parlance of the time, in trade. According to every rule of Edward's world, James should have been beneath notice, certainly beneath friendship. The son of an earl did not consort with the son of a mill owner, no matter how gilded that mill owner's fortune might be. But children, thankfully, often have not yet learned the full catalogue of their parents' prejudices. And so, in the garden at Devonshire House, while their parents networked and schemed inside, Edward and James became friends. Not the careful, formal friendship of two young gentlemen being groomed for society, but real friendship, the kind where boys race through hedgerows and make up elaborate games and share secrets in the way that only children can. For perhaps the only time in his young life, Edward felt seen, felt valued, not for his title, but for himself. James didn't care that Edward was an earl. In fact, he barely understood what an earl was. To James, Edward was simply Edward, a boy who needed a friend. That friendship lasted one glorious season. They met in secret in parks, in the corners of receptions where adults weren't paying attention. Edward began to understand that there was a world beyond the suffocating expectations of his title. A world where people laughed because something was funny, not because it was socially appropriate. Where conversations could be about ideas rather than pedigrees. And then, inevitably, the friendship was discovered. Edward's mother found a note, a childish thing, where James had invited Edward to visit his family's new house in Belgravia. The Countess read it with the kind of horror reserved for discovering plague. Her son, the heir to the Haddon title, fraternizing with the spawn of a tradesman? It was unthinkable. It was a stain on the family honor. It could not stand. She didn't shout. Women of her class didn't shout. Instead, she explained to Edward, in tones of ice, exactly what his friendship meant. It meant he was degrading himself. It meant he was betraying his ancestors. It meant he was not fit to bear the Haddon name. And then came the punishment. Edward was forbidden from ever seeing or speaking to James again. But more than that, he was made to write a letter, dictated by his mother, telling James that their friendship had been a mistake, that Edward had been temporarily confused, but that he now understood that there was an unbridgeable gulf between them, and that James should never attempt to contact him again. 7 years old, and Edward was forced to betray the only genuine friendship he had ever known. He wrote the letter with tears streaming down his face, and his mother stood over him, unmoved, telling him that this was what it meant to be an earl, that sometimes one must do difficult things to maintain proper standards. James, of course, received the letter. And here's where the story becomes almost unbearably poignant. Because James, who did not understand the Byzantine rules of aristocratic society, who had been raised by parents who believed in the revolutionary notion that people should be judged by their character rather than their birth, was devastated. He wrote back, pleading, asking what he had done wrong, promising to be better if only Edward would tell him how. Those letters never reached Edward. The Countess intercepted them all and burned them, one by one, in the morning room fireplace, destroying any chance of reconciliation. Edward never forgot James Ashworth. As the years passed, as he was educated in the finest schools, as he made the grand tour of Europe that was obligatory for young men of his class, as he was eventually presented at court and took his seat in the House of Lords, James remained a ghost in his memory, but not a comforting ghost. No, Edward had learned his lesson too well. His mother's words had taken root in soil that was already poisoned by aristocratic pride. The pain of that lost friendship had curdled into something else, something toxic. Edward convinced himself that his mother had been right, that James had been beneath him, that the entire painful episode had been an attempt by social climbers to corrupt a young earl's judgment. But if you're wondering why this story is titled what it is, why we're talking about envy and cruelty, it's because Edward's feelings toward James Ashworth didn't simply fade into indifferent dismissal. Instead, they transmuted into obsession. Even as he convinced himself that James was beneath him, Edward found himself following James's progress through society with an attention that bordered on mania. And what he saw filled him with something he would never admit to himself: pure, corrosive envy. Because here's what had happened in the years since that childhood friendship was destroyed. Thomas Ashworth's fortune had not just grown, it had exploded. The cotton mills had multiplied, and Thomas had proven to have not just luck, but genuine business acumen. He had diversified into railways, into shipping, into banking. By 1865, when Edward was 16 and James was 17, the Ashworth fortune was estimated at something north of £3 million, a sum that made even the ancient Haddon wealth look modest. But money alone wouldn't have been enough to breach the walls of society. The aristocracy had centuries of practice in keeping wealthy tradesmen at arm's length. What changed everything was Thomas Ashworth's brilliance and his son's charm. Thomas began buying up land, not piecemeal but entire estates. He purchased a seat in Parliament, which was perfectly legal if morally dubious. He married his daughters to the younger sons of baronets and viscounts, men whose titles were old but whose pockets were empty, a trade of money for legitimacy that had been happening for centuries but which had accelerated in the cash-hungry years following the agricultural depression. And James, Golden James, had gone to Oxford, where despite the initial snubbing from aristocratic students, he had gradually won over even his harshest critics with a combination of wit, generosity, and an apparently genuine lack of resentment toward those who had initially scorned him. By 1870, James Ashworth had achieved something remarkable. He had been accepted, not grudgingly, but enthusiastically, into the highest reaches of London society. He was invited to the best houses. He danced with dukes' daughters. He was mentioned in the society pages with the kind of warm approval usually reserved for old Etonian cricketers and war heroes. And in 1872, the year before our main story truly begins, James did something that should have been impossible. He became engaged to Lady Catherine Pemberton, the daughter of the Duke of Westmere, one of the oldest and most respected titles in England. The announcement sent shockwaves through society, but not the shockwaves of scandal. Instead, it was received with delight. James Ashworth, the self-made man's son who had proven himself worthy, marrying into one of the great ducal families. It was seen as romantic, as proof that the old barriers were falling, that Britain was entering a new age where merit might matter as much as birth. The newspapers covered it breathlessly. Punch magazine ran a cartoon showing a factory smokestack being incorporated into a family crest, captioned "The New Heraldry." Even Queen Victoria, who heard of it through court gossip, was said to have remarked that it was a welcome sign of progress. Edward Algernon Fitzwilliam, now 24 and the 7th Earl of Haddon following his father's death 2 years prior, read the engagement announcement in the Times while having breakfast in the dining room at Haddon Hall. And something inside him shattered. Not broke, shattered. Because suddenly, with perfect clarity, he understood something that had been fermenting in his subconscious for years. James Ashworth had won. Not just won at business or won at society, but won at life in a way that Edward, for all his ancient title and his thousands of acres, never could. James was beloved. People genuinely liked him, not because he was an earl who had to be deferred to, but because he was charming and kind and interesting. James was marrying for love and being loved in return, while Edward's own engagement to the Honourable Miss Sophronia Cavendish was a bloodless alliance of two old families attempting to shore up their respective fortunes through strategic breeding. James had built something, had taken his father's money and turned it into social capital through his own efforts, while Edward had simply inherited everything and was slowly watching it drain away through agricultural decline and his own poor management. James was looking toward a future bright with possibility, while Edward was shackled to a past he could never escape. But here's the crucial point. The moment where sympathy for Edward's position must end. Because a healthy person, confronted with this realization, might have used it as an opportunity for growth, might have recognized that his own unhappiness stemmed from a system that valued birth over character, that his mother's cruelty had poisoned his childhood, that there was still time to build a meaningful life. Edward was not a healthy person. Edward had been raised in a system that told him he was inherently superior, and when confronted with evidence that this was a lie, he didn't question the system. He questioned James Ashworth's right to exist. Over the next year, as James and Catherine's wedding approached, Edward became consumed. He began collecting information about James, about the Ashworth family, about their business dealings, about every social event James attended, every speech he gave, every mention in the press. His servants grew concerned. His fiancée, the long-suffering Sophronia, gently suggested that perhaps he was taking too keen an interest in the affairs of others. Edward dismissed her concerns with barely concealed contempt. She didn't understand. How could she? She was merely the daughter of a baron, adequate to breed future earls, but not equipped to grasp the magnitude of what was at stake. And what was at stake, in Edward's increasingly unhinged mind, was nothing less than the natural order of society. James Ashworth was an abomination, proof that the world Edward had been promised was a lie. If someone like James could succeed, could be happy, could be admired, then what was the point of being an earl? What value did the Haddon title hold if a mill owner's son could marry a duke's daughter? Edward convinced himself that James had to be brought down, not for personal reasons, of course not, but for the good of society, to restore proper hierarchy, to remind everyone that there were lines that could not be crossed without consequence. The wedding took place in June of 1873 at St. George's, Hanover Square, the most fashionable church in London. It was the social event of the season. The Prince of Wales attended. The church was filled with aristocrats and industrialists sitting side by side, a perfect metaphor for the changing times. James and Catherine looked radiant, genuinely in love in a way that made even the most cynical observers smile. The wedding breakfast afterward, held at Westmere House, was legendary. Champagne flowed, orchestras played, and as the sun set over London, James and Catherine danced their first dance as husband and wife, while 500 guests looked on with genuine affection. Edward was invited, of course. One did not exclude an earl from such an event, no matter how little one might like him personally. And Edward attended, dressed impeccably, maintaining the cold, formal demeanor that people had come to expect from him. He stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching James and Catherine dance, watching the joy on their faces, watching the way society had embraced this union. And in that moment, watching James achieve happiness that Edward could never imagine for himself, something snapped. The envy that had been building for years crystallized into something harder, something sharper, into pure, focused hatred. If this story seems like it's taking a dark turn, I need you to understand that we haven't even reached the depths yet. Because what Edward did next, what he spent the following months planning with the kind of meticulous attention he had never given to managing his own estates or caring for his own dependents, was not a crime of passion. It was calculated cruelty, designed specifically to destroy not just James's reputation, but his spirit, to take away everything that made James happy, to prove that no matter how high a tradesman's son might climb, he could still be crushed by his betters. And if you're gripped by this story, if you're wondering how far Edward would go and what price he would ultimately pay, then make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because this is exactly the kind of deep dive into the darkness of old money that we specialize in. Hit that subscribe button, because the stories get darker and the history gets richer, and you won't want to miss what's coming. Now, before we continue with Edward's campaign of destruction, I need you to understand the specific vulnerability that James Ashworth had, the crack in his armor that Edward would exploit with surgical precision. Because despite all his success, despite his marriage and his social acceptance, James was still, in the eyes of certain segments of society, fundamentally an outsider. Old money families might smile at him, might invite him to dinners, might even genuinely like him, but there was always an asterisk next to his name in their minds. He was acceptable because he had proven himself, but that acceptance was conditional. It could be revoked if he stepped out of line, if he proved unworthy, if he validated the prejudices that still lurked beneath the polished surface of progressive attitudes. Edward understood this with perfect clarity. And he understood something else too. Reputation in Victorian society was everything, and reputation could be destroyed with nothing more than whispers and implications, carefully planted rumors that grew in the dark soil of existing prejudices. You didn't need proof, you just needed doubt. You just needed to activate people's latent suspicions, to remind them that perhaps they had been too hasty in accepting this newcomer, that perhaps blood would tell after all. The campaign began subtly, so subtly that James himself didn't notice it at first. Edward started by approaching his network of aristocratic connections, men he had gone to school with, fellow members of his clubs, distant cousins scattered throughout the upper reaches of society. He would bring up James in conversation, always carefully, always with a tone of reluctant concern rather than open hostility. He would say things like, "I hope I'm wrong, but I heard something rather troubling about young Ashworth's business practices," and then refused to elaborate, shaking his head as if too troubled to continue. Or he would mention, with carefully crafted casualness, that he had heard rumors, unsubstantiated of course, about improprieties in how the Ashworth fortune had been built. Something about exploitation of child workers, something about unsafe conditions in the mills, something about sharp practices in business deals. None of it was true. The Ashworth mills, while certainly not utopias, were actually among the better managed in Manchester, with shorter hours and safer conditions than most of their competitors. Thomas Ashworth, whatever his flaws, had never been accused of the kind of brutal exploitation that characterized the worst of industrial capitalism. But Edward understood that truth was less important than perception, and that people were always willing to believe the worst about someone who had risen above their station. The whispers spread, as whispers do. At dinner parties, in gentlemen's clubs, in drawing rooms across Mayfair, people began to murmur. Nothing concrete, just vague suggestions that perhaps they had been too quick to embrace James Ashworth, that perhaps there was something not quite right about the family, that perhaps all that money had been made in ways that didn't bear close examination. And because these whispers were coming from an Earl, from someone whose social position gave him credibility, they were given weight. People began to look at James differently, began to question whether his charm was genuine or calculated, began to wonder if they had been played for fools. But Edward wasn't satisfied with vague rumors. He wanted something more concrete, something that would truly damage James's standing. And so he turned his attention to James's business interests. Because James, following his father's example, had begun to take an active role in the family enterprises. He sat on the boards of several companies, he managed investments, he was, in the language of the time, a man of business. And Edward, using his connections and his money, set out to sabotage every venture James touched. It started with a railway company in which James had invested heavily and to whose board he had recently been elected. Edward used his connections to block crucial legislation that the railway needed to expand into new territory. He spread rumors about the railway's financial stability, causing investors to pull back. He even went so far as to secretly purchase shares in a competing railway and then used his influence to ensure that contracts and rights-of-way went to the competitor rather than to James's company. The railway didn't fail completely, but it stumbled, and James, as the newest member of the board and the one without an ancient title to shield him, bore much of the blame. Then there was a proposed development project in London, a plan to build modern housing that would be both comfortable and affordable, a genuinely progressive idea for the time. James was one of the primary backers, both financially and in terms of public advocacy. Edward worked behind the scenes to ensure that every permit application was delayed, every approval was contested. Every step forward met resistance from local authorities. He used his position in the House of Lords to speak against similar projects, framing them as threats to the character of London, as evidence of the dangerous spread of commercial values into areas that should remain residential. The project eventually collapsed under the weight of bureaucratic resistance, costing James both money and credibility. Each of these setbacks, individually, could be explained away as bad luck or poor judgment. But together, they created a narrative that Edward carefully cultivated, that James Ashworth was out of his depth, that his success had been a lucky accident, that when he tried to operate at the highest levels of business and society, he revealed himself to be nothing more than a jumped-up mill owner's son, without the breeding or the acumen to truly succeed. And people, especially people who had never been entirely comfortable with James's rise in the first place, were all too willing to believe this narrative. The personal toll on James was devastating. He had genuinely believed that he had been accepted, that his merit and his character had overcome the prejudices of birth. To discover that he was still viewed with suspicion, that his failures were seen as proof of inherent unworthiness rather than simple bad luck, was psychologically crushing. He began to doubt himself, began to wonder if perhaps they were right, if perhaps he had been foolish to think he could ever truly belong in a world that had been designed to exclude people like him. Catherine, his wife, watched the man she loved wither under the weight of social censure and business failure. She tried to support him, tried to use her own connections and her family's influence to counter the whispers, but she was fighting against currents she didn't fully understand. She knew that someone was orchestrating this campaign against her husband, but she didn't know who or why. Edward had been far too careful to leave any obvious trail back to himself. To most observers, he appeared simply as one voice among many, expressing concern about Ashworth's suitability. By the autumn of 1874, just over a year after the wedding that had seemed to herald a new age of social mobility and meritocracy, James Ashworth was a shadow of his former self. The invitations that had once flooded in had slowed to a trickle. The society pages that had once praised him now barely mentioned him, and when they did, it was with faint damnation. His business ventures, even those that should have succeeded on their merits, found doors closed and opportunities blocked. And through it all, James had no idea why this was happening, no target for his frustration, no way to fight back against an enemy he couldn't see. Edward, watching this destruction unfold, should have felt satisfaction. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it? To prove that the natural order could not be overturned, that a man without breeding would always eventually reveal his inadequacy, that the Haddon title meant something that mere money and charm could never challenge. But satisfaction wasn't what Edward felt. Instead, as he watched James's decline, he felt nothing. Just a hollow emptiness where some other emotion should have been. Because destroying James hadn't made Edward feel superior. It had just made him realize that his entire life was built on cruelty and fear. But we're not done with this story. We haven't reached the burial yet, the moment when envy and cruelty would collide with consequence. Because while Edward had been focused entirely on destroying James, he had neglected to notice that his own world was crumbling around him. The Haddon estates, never well managed even under his father, had deteriorated significantly under Edward's neglectful stewardship. The tenant farmers, already struggling with agricultural depression, were being crushed by Edward's insistence on maintaining traditional rent levels, even as crop prices plummeted. Several had been evicted for inability to pay, their families turned out of homes they had occupied for generations, creating a groundswell of local resentment. The Haddon finances were in chaos. Edward had spent vast sums on his campaign against James, on bribes and payments to people who could provide information or influence, on purchasing shares in companies solely to sabotage them. The estate income, declining due to the agricultural crisis, couldn't support this expenditure. Edward had begun borrowing against the estate, taking out loans from banks and moneylenders at ruinous rates of interest. The ancestral hall was being quietly stripped of valuables, paintings sold, silver pawned, anything that could be liquidated without too much public notice. And then there was Sophronia, his long-suffering fiancée, who had waited patiently through endless postponements of their wedding, who had endured Edward's cold indifference and his obvious preference for obsessing over James Ashworth, rather than building any kind of relationship with her. In December of 1874, Sophronia finally had enough. She broke off the engagement, citing irreconcilable differences, which in the language of the time was code for Edward's complete unsuitability as a husband. The scandal was immediate and delicious to London society. An Earl jilted by a baron's daughter? Unheard of. Clearly, there was something seriously wrong with the Earl of Haddon. People began to look more closely at Edward, and what they saw was disturbing. He appeared disheveled, distracted, obsessed. Servants who had left his employ began to talk, carefully at first, but then more openly, about his fixation on James Ashworth, about the hours spent reading every mention of Ashworth in the papers, about the files and files of information he had compiled. The picture that emerged was of a man unhinged, consumed by envy to the point of madness. Society, which had been willing to listen to Edward's whispers about James, now turned those same whispers on Edward himself. An Earl obsessed with a commoner? How unseemly. How beneath his dignity. How frankly embarrassing for everyone involved. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. Where cruelty finds cruelty and creates something monstrous. Because in January of 1875, as Edward's world continued its collapse, and as James struggled with his own ruins, something happened that would bind these two men together in the most horrific way possible. Catherine Ashworth, James's beloved wife, the woman whose marriage to James had represented everything Edward envied, died in childbirth. Both she and the infant were lost, a tragedy that was all too common in that era, but no less devastating for its frequency. James was destroyed. The man who had climbed so high, who had seemed to have everything, now had nothing. His business reputation was shattered, his social standing was precarious, and now his wife, the love of his life, was gone. He retreated from society entirely, moving back to Manchester to be near his family, leaving London behind. For most people, this would have been enough. James had been broken. He posed no threat to anyone's sense of social order. He was no longer a triumphant example of meritocracy, but rather a cautionary tale about reaching above one's station. But for Edward, Catherine's death triggered something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but guilt. Because in his obsessive focus on destroying James, Edward had been so consumed with taking everything James had that he hadn't stopped to consider that James actually loved his wife, that their marriage had been real, in a way Edward's arranged engagement never could have been. Seeing James's genuine grief, understanding the depth of loss that no amount of social restoration could heal, Edward finally confronted what he had become. A monster. Animated by envy, who had wielded cruelty as a weapon against someone whose only crime was being happy. The guilt was overwhelming, but Edward, broken by years of emotional repression and aristocratic conditioning that taught him feelings were weakness, had no healthy way to process it. Instead of seeking reconciliation, instead of trying to make amends, instead of using this moment of clarity to change course, Edward did what so many people do when confronted with their own monstrosity. He doubled down. He convinced himself that his guilt was actually further proof of James's wrongness, that James's capacity to inspire such strong emotions was a kind of manipulation, that everything that had happened was somehow James's fault for daring to rise above his station in the first place. In March of 1875, Edward made a decision that would seal both their fates. He would finish what he had started. He would ensure that James Ashworth was not just broken, but buried, removed entirely from any position where he might rebuild or recover. And to do this, Edward would deploy the ultimate weapon of Victorian society, the accusation of moral depravity. He would spread a rumor so vile, so beyond the pale, that no defense would be possible, that even James's family would have to distance themselves from him. The rumor Edward crafted was insidious in its details. He claimed, through carefully chosen intermediaries, that James's interest in social housing projects had not been philanthropic, but rather a cover for seeking out vulnerable women. That the real reason for James's business failures was that he had been embezzling money to pay off victims of his predation. That Catherine had died not simply in childbirth, but from complications arising from discovering her husband's true nature, from a grief so profound that it had affected her health. It was all lies, all vicious fabrication, but it was designed to fit perfectly into existing prejudices about nouveau rich social climbers, about men who rose too fast having something to hide, about the moral bankruptcy that supposedly lurked beneath the shiny surface of industrial wealth. Edward knew that once such rumors were released into the world, they would be impossible to recall or refute. Denial would be seen as proof of guilt. Silence would be interpreted as admission. There was no winning move for James, no way to prove a negative, no way to demonstrate that something hadn't happened. It was the perfect weapon, The kind of accusation that destroyed lives while leaving the accuser's hands apparently clean. But Edward made a mistake, the first real mistake in his campaign of destruction. He was so focused on crafting the perfect rumor that he failed to adequately disguise his role in spreading it. One of his intermediaries, a dissolute younger son of a marquess, whom Edward had paid to spread the stories in Manchester society, got drunk at a club and bragged about the Earl who was paying him to destroy James Ashworth's reputation. The story got back to Thomas Ashworth, James's father, who was still a formidable figure despite his age, and who had been quietly conducting his own investigation into the forces arrayed against his son. Thomas Ashworth was a self-made man who had not built an industrial empire by being naive or easily intimidated. When he learned that Edward Fitzwilliam, the Earl of Haddon, was behind the systematic destruction of his son's life, Thomas didn't go to the authorities. Victorian law was not designed to protect the reputation of commoners against the actions of earls. Instead, Thomas did something far more devastating. He started to buy up Edward's debts. Quietly, systematically, Thomas purchased every note, every loan, every IOU that Edward had scattered across London's financial institutions. It took months and cost a fortune. But by autumn of 1875, Thomas Ashworth owned the Earl of Haddon's financial ruin. And then Thomas did something that was, in its way, more cruel than anything Edward had done. He called in every debt simultaneously, demanding immediate payment in full. He knew Edward couldn't pay. He knew that doing so would force Edward to sell everything, to break up the Haddon estates, to destroy the legacy that Edward claimed to be protecting, to reduce the Earl of Haddon to poverty. It was revenge, pure and simple, and it was devastating. Edward received the notices in October of 1875. The cumulative debt was staggering, more than £300,000, roughly equivalent to perhaps £50 million or more in modern money. There was no possibility of payment, no wealthy relative to turn to, no way out. The Haddon estates would have to be sold, piece by piece, broken up and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Everything that Edward had believed defined him, everything he had been raised to protect, everything that supposedly made him superior to people like James Ashworth, would be gone. But Thomas Ashworth wasn't finished. He made sure that everyone knew exactly why this was happening. He had the evidence of Edward's campaign against James compiled into a document, and he distributed it widely through both aristocratic and commercial circles. The intercepted letters, the testimonies of people Edward had bribed, the pattern of sabotage, all of it laid out in devastating detail. And he made sure that the final, vicious rumor about James was traced directly back to Edward, exposing not just the cruelty but the cowardice of attacking a grieving widower with sexual slander. The reaction was swift and brutal. Because while Victorian society had been willing to look the other way at subtle social cruelty, while whisper campaigns and strategic sabotage were accepted as part of how the game was played, there were lines that couldn't be crossed, not even by an earl. Making up accusations of sexual impropriety, attacking a man who had just lost his wife, doing so out of pure envy rather than any legitimate grievance, these were beyond the pale. Society, which had been slowly turning on Edward already, now rejected him entirely. The social death was immediate. Edward was blackballed from his clubs. Invitations stopped. When he appeared in public, people turned their backs. The Earl of Haddon, whose title had once guaranteed him respect and deference, was now an outcast, shunned by the very society he had claimed to be protecting. And the most delicious irony, the thing that must have tormented Edward in his final months, was that James Ashworth, the man he had tried to destroy, was suddenly the object of widespread sympathy. People who had been willing to believe the worst about James now saw him as a victim of aristocratic persecution. His reputation, so carefully demolished by Edward, was restored almost overnight. The Haddon estate sales began in December of 1875. It took months to liquidate everything. A slow, agonizing process where centuries of accumulated wealth and history were dispersed to the winds. The paintings went first, sold at auction to American millionaires and continental collectors. The furniture followed, the silver, the books, the wine cellars. Then the land itself, sold off farm by farm to whoever could afford it. Some of the tenant farmers, the ones who had scraped together enough money or secured loans, bought their own farms, a small justice after generations of paying rent to uncaring landlords. Much of the rest was bought by Thomas Ashworth, who took grim satisfaction in becoming the largest landowner in Derbyshire, an industrial baron now holding the same land that aristocrats had controlled for centuries. Haddon Hall itself, that masterpiece of Elizabethan architecture, was sold to a railway magnate from Birmingham who turned it into a hotel, allowing common tourists to sleep in the bedrooms where earls had once slept, to dine in halls where nobles had plotted. For Edward, whose entire identity was wrapped up in his family heritage, this must have been unbearable. His ancestors' home, filled with paying guests, the aristocratic mystique stripped away and replaced with commercial hospitality. By June of 1876, it was all gone. Edward was left with nothing except a small pension that couldn't be touched by creditors, barely enough to rent modest lodgings in an unfashionable part of London. He was 32 years old, and his life, at least the life he had been raised to believe mattered, was over. He could have started again. There were plenty of examples of impoverished aristocrats who had gone into business or taken up professions. His title, while tarnished, was still his title. He could have left England, gone to the colonies, begun a new life somewhere. His history wasn't known, but Edward didn't do any of those things. Instead, he became a ghost, haunting the edges of the society that had rejected him. He spent his days in cheap taverns, drinking away what little money he had. He would corner anyone who would listen and rant about James Ashworth, about how this was all Ashworth's fault, about how the world had gone mad, about how an earl should never have been brought low by a tradesman. The few people who had known him in his days of power were embarrassed by these encounters, by how far he had fallen, by his inability to accept responsibility for his own actions. And here's where we reach the burial, the final dark chapter in the story of envy and cruelty. Because in December of 1876, almost exactly a year after the estate sales had begun, Edward's body was found in his lodgings. He had been dead for several days before anyone noticed. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but everyone understood what had really killed him. He had been buried, not in earth, but in the consequences of his own choices, suffocated by envy, crushed by the weight of his cruelty turning back on itself. He was 33 years old. The funeral was a small, sad affair. A few distant relatives attended out of obligation, but there was no grand procession, no lying in state, none of the pomp that usually accompanied the death of an earl. He was buried in the family plot at the church near what had been Haddon Hall, but even this was contested. The church authorities were reluctant to give him a prominent position given the scandal of his life. He ended up in a corner of the plot, his grave marked with a simple stone bearing only his name and dates. None of the laudatory inscription that usually decorated aristocratic graves. And what of James Ashworth, the object of all this envy and target of all this cruelty? His story, mercifully, has a slightly less bleak ending, though it would be wrong to call it happy. After Catherine's death, he never remarried. He threw himself into the family businesses, managing them with skill and dedication. The reputation that Edward had tried to destroy was indeed restored, helped considerably by the revelation of Edward's persecution. James became known as a man of integrity who had been unjustly attacked, and this reputation served him well in business circles. But James was never the same after Catherine's death and the terrible years that followed. The optimism, the belief in social progress, the confidence that had defined his youth were gone. He became more cautious, more withdrawn, more cynical about human nature and the possibilities of social change. He did good works, funded schools and hospitals, but there was a mechanical quality to his philanthropy, as if he were going through the motions rather than acting from genuine passion. The joy had been taken from him, and while he survived, while he even prospered again, he never fully recovered the person he had been before envy and cruelty had targeted him. Thomas Ashworth, James's father, lived to see his son's rehabilitation, but died in 1880 without ever fully forgiving himself for not protecting James better, for not seeing the threat earlier, for allowing aristocratic prejudice to harm his son. The Ashworth fortune continued to grow, and in a bitter irony, James's son, James Jr., born from a second marriage undertaken more from duty than love, eventually received a baronetcy for services to industry. The family that Edward had tried to destroy ended up with a title of their own, while the Haddon earldom, lacking any heirs, eventually became extinct. So what are we to make of this story, this tale of buried envy and cruel obsession? It would be easy to read it as a simple morality play about the dangers of jealousy, or as a predictable story of aristocratic decline and middle-class rise. But I think there's something deeper here, something that resonates beyond the specific circumstances of Victorian England. This is a story about what happens when our entire sense of identity is built on being better than other people. When our self-worth is contingent on maintaining hierarchy rather than developing character. When we mistake privilege for virtue. Edward's tragedy, and it was a tragedy even if he was the architect of his own destruction, was that he was raised in a system that told him he was special because of an accident of birth, that his worth was inherent rather than earned. When confronted with someone who had built worth through character and effort, Edward could only see it as a threat, as a challenge to the fundamental lies he had been taught about the world. He couldn't admire James, couldn't learn from him, couldn't recognize that there was room in the world for both inherited status and earned respect. Instead, he had to destroy James, had to prove that the old hierarchies were still valid, that titles still mattered more than character. But in doing so, Edward destroyed himself far more thoroughly than he ever managed to destroy James, because he proved exactly what he was trying to disprove, that a title without character is worthless. That being an Earl meant nothing if you were also a petty, vindictive, obsessive bully, that the old order Edward was trying to preserve deserved to fall. His cruelty didn't reinforce social hierarchies. It exposed them as hollow, as nothing more than scaffolding for mediocre people to feel superior to their betters. And James's tragedy, less dramatic but no less real, was that he learned the wrong lesson from his persecution. He learned to be careful, to not stand out too much, to not trust too easily, to not believe too strongly in progress or justice. The system that allowed Edward to attack him, that gave credence to whispers simply because they came from an earl, that forced him to fight for acceptance, that should have been given based on merit, this system scarred James even though he ultimately survived it. He won, if you can call it winning, but at a cost that can't be calculated in pounds and pence. This story, like so many from the Gilded Age, is about the price of old money. Not just the price paid by those who had it, but the price extracted from everyone who existed in its shadow. Old money wasn't just wealth, it was power, and that power was often used not to build or create, but to exclude and destroy. Edward wielded his power like a weapon, and like any weapon carelessly used, it ended up destroying the wielder. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this story is how easily society enabled Edward's cruelty. The whispers were believed not because there was evidence, but because they fit existing prejudices. James was vulnerable not because he had done anything wrong, but because he was marked as an outsider, and outsiders were always suspect. The system that gave Edward his power also ensured that he could abuse it with minimal accountability, at least until he went too far, until he violated rules that even aristocrats had to follow. If Edward had been just slightly more careful, if he had stopped before making the sexual accusations, he might have gotten away with destroying James's reputation entirely. This is what makes old money stories so fascinating and so disturbing. They reveal the machinery of privilege, show us how systems of inequality perpetuate themselves, demonstrate the human cost of hierarchy. Edward wasn't born evil. He was born into a system that twisted him into something monstrous, that told him his envy was actually pride, that his cruelty was actually maintaining proper standards, that his obsession was actually duty to his class. And by the time he realized what he had become, assuming he ever did, it was too late. He was buried by the very envy he had cultivated, found by the very cruelty he had deployed. If you're still with me on this journey through one of the darkest corners of Gilded Age society, I'm both impressed and grateful. These stories matter, not just as historical curiosities, but as mirrors that reflect truths about power, privilege, and human nature that remain relevant today. The names and costumes have changed, the specific mechanisms of social exclusion have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics, the way that insecurity metastasizes into cruelty, the way that privilege defends itself through destruction rather than through justification, these patterns persist. And we need to be reminded of them, need to see where they lead, need to understand the cost of organizing society around hierarchy rather than human dignity. There's a memorial stone in the church near what was Haddon Hall, though Haddon Hall itself is long gone now, demolished in the early 20th century after decades as a failed hotel venture. The stone marks the Haddon family plot, and if you look carefully, you can find Edward's simple grave marker in the corner. There's no epitaph, no flowery language about beloved sons or lamented nobles, just a name, a title, and 2 dates. But if you know the story, you can read a different inscription there, one written in the consequences of choices and the arithmetic of cruelty. It reads, "Here lies a man who had everything except contentment, who wielded power without wisdom, who chose envy over empathy, and who discovered too late that burying others only digs your own grave deeper." In the village near the old estate, there's also a school, the Catherine Ashworth Memorial School, endowed by James after his wife's death, still operating today, teaching children without regard to their birth or their parents' position. James established it in 1878, using some of the money he made from buying pieces of the Haddon estate. It was his way of turning tragedy into something constructive, of ensuring that Catherine's memory was associated with education and opportunity rather than simply with loss. It wasn't enough, could never be enough to heal the wounds or restore what was taken, but it was something, a small assertion of the values that Edward had tried so hard to destroy. The irony is thick, isn't it? The Earl who tried to preserve aristocratic power by destroying a commoner ended up homeless and broken, his estates parceled out to the very class he despised, his family line extinct. The commoner who was supposed to know his place ended up founding institutions that outlasted the aristocracy itself, ended up proving through his survival that character might matter more than birth after all. But this isn't really a story about good triumphing over evil, because both men were destroyed by what happened. Neither emerged whole. Edward is buried in an anonymous grave, forgotten by history except as a cautionary tale. James survived but carried the scars forever, the optimism beaten out of him, the belief in progress and justice replaced with wariness and cynicism. And what of the system that enabled all of this? The structure of old money and aristocratic privilege that gave Edward his weapon and made James vulnerable. It did eventually fall, though not because of this story. The Gilded Age faded into the Edwardian period, which gave way to the catastrophe of World War I, which shattered the old certainties forever. The great houses were turned into hospitals or hotels or demolished entirely. The estates were broken up by death duties and agricultural depression. The titles remained, but increasingly hollow, increasingly irrelevant. The world that Edward had tried to preserve was doomed anyway. His cruelty was not only monstrous, but pointless, defending something that was already dying. There's a lesson there, though not a comforting one. Sometimes the cruelest acts are committed in defense of things that don't deserve defending, in service to systems that should be allowed to fall. Edward could have accepted change, could have adapted to a world where birth mattered less than character, could have found meaning in building rather than destroying. But he was so invested in the old order, so dependent on it for his sense of identity, that he couldn't imagine surviving its fall. And so he fought, viciously and desperately, against the inevitable. And when he lost, when the walls came down and the pretenses were stripped away, there was nothing left of him. He had confused his title with his self, had mistaken his position for his person, and when one was taken, the other evaporated. James, for all his success, couldn't fully escape the system either. He was changed by his persecution, hardened by it, made cynical by the revelation that merit wasn't enough, that progress wasn't inevitable, that cruelty could strike from above with impunity. His later life, while materially comfortable and even successful, was marked by a profound disillusionment. He did good works, but without joy. He built businesses, but without passion. He had won the battle but lost something essential in the process, some core belief in human goodness or social possibility that had animated his youth. So perhaps the real burial in this story isn't Edward's death or the dissolution of his estate, but the burial of hope, the crushing of the belief that society could change for the better, that people could be judged by their character rather than their birth. Edward tried to bury James, and in the process, buried himself. But both of them were ultimately buried by a system that pitted them against each other, that told Edward his worth depended on James's unworthiness, that told James his acceptance was conditional on aristocratic approval. Neither man escaped that system. Both were consumed by it, in different ways and to different degrees. If there's any redemption in this story, any light in this darkness, it's in the small acts of resistance against the system itself. The tenant farmers who finally owned their own land. The children who attended the school James built, learning that education was a right rather than a privilege. The dissolution of the Haddon estates, which showed that aristocratic power wasn't eternal, wasn't unbreakable. These are small victories, insufficient to balance the scale against the human cost, but real nonetheless. History, for all its cruelty and injustice, does sometimes bend, slowly and painfully, towards something better. But we should be careful not to read this as a story of inevitable progress. The same forces that animated Edward's cruelty, the same insecurities and hierarchies and weapons of social destruction, they didn't disappear when the Gilded Age ended. They adapt, they evolve, they find new forms and new targets. The specifics change, but the pattern persists. Those who have power become desperate to keep it, those who threaten the hierarchy become targets, and cruelty becomes the tool by which the old order tries to preserve itself. Understanding this story isn't about judging people from the past, it's about recognizing patterns that continue to shape the present. And on that sobering note, we've reached the end of our journey through one of the darkest and most psychologically complex stories of the Gilded Age. Edward Fitzwilliam, 7th Earl of Haddon, buried by his own envy, found by his own cruelty. Ending his life alone in cheap lodgings, everything he thought defined him stripped away. James Ashworth, the target of that envy and that cruelty, surviving but scarred, building a life but never fully recovering the joy and optimism that had once defined him. Two men, bound together by obsession and persecution, both ultimately destroyed by a system that valued birth over character and privilege over justice. If this story has moved you, disturbed you, made you think about power and privilege in new ways, then it's served its purpose. These aren't comfortable stories, but they're important ones. They remind us of what humanity is capable of, both the cruelty and the resilience, both the capacity for destruction and the possibility of survival. They show us the architecture of oppression, the mechanics of how those with power use it to crush those without it, and the price everyone pays when society is organized around hierarchy rather than dignity. The Gilded Age was called Gilded for a reason. All that glittered wasn't gold. It was just a thin layer of shine covering rot and corruption. The great houses hid unhappiness and abuse. The fancy titles masked mediocrity and cruelty. The old money was stained with the suffering of everyone it exploited or excluded. Edward's story is, in microcosm, the story of his entire class, a story of people so invested in their own superiority that they would destroy themselves rather than admit that superiority was a lie. And James's story is the story of everyone who has ever had to fight for recognition that should have been freely given, who has ever been judged by circumstances of birth rather than content of character, who has ever learned the hard way that merit isn't enough in a world organized around privilege. Thank you for taking this dark journey with me through the corridors of old money and the depths of human envy. If you found this exploration valuable, if you want more deep dives into the secrets and scandals, the cruelty and consequences of the Gilded Age, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit that subscribe button, because there are so many more stories to tell, so many more forgotten scandals to unearth, so many more lessons to learn from the Gilded Darkness. Until next time, remember that history isn't just about dates and events, it's about people. And people are capable of both terrible cruelty and remarkable resilience. The question is always which capacity we choose to cultivate, and what price we're willing to pay for the choices we make.